Stop scrolling for a moment. If the last chapter of your life ended quietly, without closure, without celebration, without explanation, this video is for you. You didn't let fail. You didn't fall behind. And nothing went wrong. What ended wasn't your motivation. It was a timeline that had already expired. That strange exhaustion you felt, that wasn't burnout. That sudden calm after chaos, that wasn't numbness. That silence where anxiety used to live, that wasn't emptiness. It was completion. You are not starting over. You are not being tested again. You are not waiting for something to happen, something already finished. And once you understand what just ended, you'll never try to return to the old version of your life again. Congratulations. It's finally over. 1. The end you felt was real. What ended in you wasn't motivation. It wasn't hope. And it wasn't strength. What ended was the version of reality that required you to suffer to survive. That exhaustion you felt wasn't burnout. It was completion. There comes a moment when the mind realizes something before the world does. You kept waking up tired, not because life was heavy, but because you were still carrying something that had already expired. A role, a struggle, a pattern, a version of yourself that no longer matched your awareness. And when a timeline expires, it doesn't explode, it powers down. That's why nothing dramatic happened. No grand goodbye, no loud ending, just a quiet internal, knowing that said, I can do this anymore. That sentence wasn't weakness, it was authority. People misunderstand endings because they expect destruction. But real endings feel like relief mixed with confusion. You stop fighting, not because you lost, but because there's nothing left to fight for. The resistance disappears. The urgency fades. The emotional noise goes silent. That's when most people panic, because silence feels unfamiliar. But silence is not emptiness. Silence is confirmation. Think about it carefully. When something is still active, it demands energy. It pulls your attention. It triggers emotion. It creates friction. But when something finishes its purpose, it releases you. That's what you felt. You didn't fall apart. You disengaged. The old timeline stopped responding to effort. Goals that once drove you felt hollow. Problems that once consumed you lost their grip. Even fear began to feel distant, like it belonged to someone else. That's not detachment from life. That's detachment from limitation. Your nervous system noticed it first. That's why rest didn't fix the tiredness. Sleep couldn't reset it. Motivation speeches didn't work, because this wasn't fatigue. It was closure. And here is the part most people never realize. You cannot revive what has already ended. Trying to go back felt impossible because the system was already shut down. The doors didn't close violently. They simply stopped opening. Opportunities faded. Old desires lost flavor. Old identities stopped fitting. That wasn't punishment. That was mercy. Reality doesn't keep you trapped once you've learned what you came to learn. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't explain. It quietly removes the stage and waits for you to notice that the play is over. And the moment you stopped blaming yourself, the moment you stopped trying to fix what felt wrong, the moment you allowed the ending instead of resisting it, that's when peace entered. Not excitement, not joy, peace. Because peace only arrives after something completes successfully. So if you're wondering whether what you felt was real, it was. If you're wondering whether you imagined the ending, you didn't. If you're wondering why you couldn't continue even if you tried, it's because there was nothing left to continue. The old timeline didn't fail, it finished. And you are still here because you were never meant to end with it. 2. Collapse is proof of advancement. Nothing collapses unless it has been outgrown. That's the truth most people never hear. Collapse is not the sign of failure. It is the evidence of evolution. When something breaks in your life right after a period of inner growth, it's not bad timing. It's perfect timing. The mind upgrades quietly, but reality responds loudly. You didn't wake up one day and decide to abandon the old structure. The structure failed to support the new level of awareness you had already reached. It's like pouring more voltage into an outdated system. The system doesn't adjust, it shuts down. That's what happened. Relationships, routines, ambitions, even identities began to crumble because they were built for a smaller version of you. And when awareness expands, the walls that once felt safe begin to feel suffocating. This is where people make the mistake of self-blame. They say, "What did I do wrong?" They assume collapse means sabotage. They try to fix what is no longer compatible. But nothing that truly belongs in your next phase collapses. What collapses is what cannot come with you. The discomfort you felt wasn't loss, it was misalignment becoming visible. Before collapse, misalignment hides behind habit. You tolerate things. You adjust yourself downward. You normalize what drains you. Growth exposes that lie. Suddenly, what once felt acceptable feels unbearable. Not because it became worse, but because you became sharper. Your tolerance dropped. Your nervous system stopped agreeing to compromise your clarity. And that sips when the collapse accelerates. Reality begins removing support beams. Conversations stop landing. Effort stops producing results. Momentum evaporates. You push harder, but nothing moves. That sip's not resistance, that sip's a lockout. You weren't set blocked because you weren't set ready. You were blocked because you were done. Think about it. If you had not advanced internally, the old timeline would still function. The fact that it no longer works proves that you surpassed its capacity. And advancement doesn't feel powerful at first. It feels lonely. It feels confusing. It feels like standing in rubble wondering what went wrong. But rubble only appears after demolition. And demolition only happens when a structure is scheduled for replacement. You weren't set watching your life fall apart. You were watching load-bearing illusions collapse. False roles, outdated expectations, external definitions of success that no longer matched your internal truth. The collapse didn't attack you, it freed you. And here's the part that confirms it was advancement, not destruction. Even while things were falling apart externally, something inside you stayed calm. Not happy, not excited, calm. That calm is the signature of alignment. Chaos never touches the center of someone who has already moved on internally. The body might feel stress, but the core remains steady. Because deep down you knew the collapse wasn't set random. You knew it was necessary. You knew there was no going back. Advancement doesn't ask permission. It removes what can't survive at your new altitude. And once the collapse finishes, there's no urgency to rebuild immediately, because the next structure isn't created by force. It forms naturally around a free mind. 3. Confusion was the exit tunnel. The confusion you felt was not a mistake. It was the passage. Every transition between realities has a corridor, a space where the old rules no longer apply, and the new ones haven't revealed themselves yet. That space feels unstable, unfamiliar, and mentally uncomfortable. That space is called confusion. Most people fear it. They label it anxiety. They try to escape it. But confusion is not danger. It is disconnection from an expired map. The mind depends on patterns to feel safe. It wants certainty, prediction, and control. So when a timeline ends, the first thing that collapses isn't the world, it's the mental framework you use to navigate it. That's why nothing made sense. You weren't lost. You were between systems. Old motivations stopped working, but new desires hadn't formed yet. Old identities dissolved, but new ones hadn't solidified. You couldn't explain who you were becoming, only who you were no longer willing to be. That's the exit tunnel. And tunnels are dark by design. You don't decorate tunnels. You don't settle in tunnels. You pass through them. The mistake most people make is trying to figure everything out while inside the tunnel. They demand clarity from a space that exists specifically to strip certainty away. They rush decisions. They grasp at old habits. They panic and turn back. You didn't stat. Even when the mind screamed for answers, something deeper in you stayed still. You waited. You observed. You let the fog exist without forcing direction. That restraint saved you. Confusion dismantles the ego's need to control outcomes. It humbles the intellect. It trains you to move without guarantees. And once the ego releases its grip, awareness expands. That's why, after the confusion peaked, insight began to arrive quietly. Not as a plan, not as a vision, but as discernment. You suddenly knew what no longer felt right. You sensed when something was misaligned. You recognized false urgency instantly. That's not confusion anymore. That's intuition activating. The exit tunnel doesn't give you answers. It gives you sensitivity. And sensitivity is more powerful than certainty, because certainty locks you into expectations. Sensitivity keeps you responsive. You begin to feel truth instead of reasoning your way toward it. That's why rushing out of confusion delays freedom. The tunnel must do its work. It dissolves outdated beliefs. It weakens attachment to outcomes. It forces surrender, not as submission, but as intelligence. And the moment the tunnel ends, you don't arrive anywhere dramatic. You simply notice that the fog has lifted. Decisions feel lighter. Fear feels less convincing. Silence feels safe. That's how you know you passed through correctly. Confusion didn't mean you were off course. It meant you were leaving. And not everyone makes it through. You did. 4. Silence is a sign of completion. The silence that followed wasn't set emptiness. It was finality. When something is still active in your life, it makes noise. It pulls at your thoughts. It creates emotional friction. It demands reactions. But when a cycle completes, it doesn't argue. It goes quiet. That's the silence you noticed. Not the silence of loneliness, but the silence of resolution. You stopped overthinking things that once controlled your mind. The inner commentary softened. The constant urgency faded. Even problems that once felt enormous began to feel distant. That's not avoidance. That's closure. Silence arrives only after a process has finished running. Systems don't quiet down mid-operation. They quiet down when there's nothing left to process. That's why this silence felt unfamiliar. You were used to noise being your baseline. Stress, anticipation, pressure, internal dialogue. So when the noise disappeared, the mind tried to label it as something being wrong. But nothing was wrong. Something was done. Notice how you no longer feel the need to explain yourself. You don't rehearse conversations in your head. You don't seek reassurance the way you once did. That internal debate ended because the decision was already made, even if you never consciously announced it. Completion doesn't ask permission from logic. It simply settles. And once it settles, the nervous system finally stops bracing for impact. The body relaxes in a way sleep alone never achieved. Breath deepens. Presence expands. Time feels slower, but fuller. This is how you know it wasn't suppression. Suppression is tense. Silence is relaxed. Suppression feels forced. Silence feels natural. That quiet space is where authority lives. Not loud authority. Calm authority. The kind that doesn't need to prove itself. This is why people around you might feel the shift before you do. They sense that you're no longer reactive. You're not easily pulled. You don't bite at emotional hooks. Because hooks only work when something is unfinished. And you said finished. The mind that has completed a cycle does not rush to replace it. It waits. It observes. It allows reality to reorganize around it. Silence is not the absence of direction. It's just the absence of resistance. And in that absence, clarity forms without effort. So if you're in this quiet phase and wondering what comes next, don't interrupt it. Don't rush to fill the space. Don't recreate noise just to feel familiar again. This silence is not a pause. It sets a seal. The old timeline didn't fade. It closed cleanly. And once a door closes cleanly, it doesn't set echo. 5. You outgrew external control. At some point, control stopped working on you, not because you rebelled, not because you fought back, but because you no longer responded the same way. That's how control actually ends. Most systems don't rely on force. They rely on reaction. They survive on emotional triggers, fear of loss, approval seeking, and the need to be understood. As long as those buttons work, influence is effortless. But yours stopped responding. You didn't denounce it. You didn't plan it. You simply changed internally. What once provoked anxiety now barely registers. What once pressured you into compliance now feels optional. Expectations that used to feel heavy now feel irrelevant. That sets not detachment from responsibility. That sets freedom from manipulation. Control fails the moment you stop outsourcing your emotional regulation. When approval no longer validates you, disapproval loses its power. When fear no longer directs your choices, urgency dissolves. And here's the part people misunderstand. You didn't just become harder. You became clearer. Clarity is what systems cannot control. They need predictability. They need emotional leverage. They need your identity to be tied to outcomes. But once your sense of self stops depending on results, the system loses access. There's nothing to pull, nothing to threaten, nothing to promise. That's why things around you may have escalated briefly. Pressure often spikes right before control collapses. It's the last attempt to re-engage the old response pattern. But you didn't react. You paused. You observed. You chose. That pause is everything. In that pause, authority transfers. Not outward authority, internal authority. You stop being managed by circumstances and start engaging with them on your terms. You don't argue. You don't explain. You don't justify. You act when aligned and disengage when not. That's why freedom doesn't feel euphoric at first. It feels neutral. Neutrality is dangerous to control structures. It doesn't feed them energy. It doesn't amplify conflict. It doesn't create drama. It simply refuses participation. And once participation ends, influence dissolves naturally. This is why the old timeline couldn't continue. It required a version of you that was emotionally accessible to control. That version is gone, not destroyed, outgrown. And what replaces control is not chaos, it's discernment. You still care, but selectively. You still engage, but consciously. You still move, but deliberately. That SEP's not indifference. That SEP's self-governance. And a self-governing mind does not need permission to be free. 6. Pain was the final instructor. Pain didn't arrive to destroy you. It arrived to finish the training. Most people think pain is punishment, but punishment repeats the same lesson. Pain, when it appears at the end of a cycle, is not corrective. It's preparatory. It compresses awareness so nothing unnecessary survives. That's why this pain felt different. It didn't feel chaotic. It didn't feel random. It felt precise. Every experience that hurt you targeted something specific, an attachment, a belief, a dependency, an expectation. Pain didn't scatter you. It focused you. Pressure creates clarity. Under pressure, illusions collapse. Excuses disappear. You stop pretending. The mind no longer has the luxury of fantasy. It must see reality exactly as it is. That's why pain accelerates growth. Not because suffering is noble, but because suffering removes distortion. It forces honesty. You can't lie to yourself when something hurts deeply enough. And the timing matters. If pain had arrived earlier, it would have broken you. If it had arrived later, it wouldn't have been necessary. It came exactly when you were strong enough to integrate it. That's not cruelty. That's intelligence. Notice how, after the pain peaked, something shifted. You didn't become bitter. You became selective. You didn't become hardened. You became discerning. You stopped tolerating what drained you. You stopped explaining what should have been obvious. You stopped investing where return was impossible. Pain sharpened your boundaries. It trained your nervous system to recognize danger without panic. It taught you when to disengage, when to stand firm, and when to walk away without guilt. That's not trauma, that's refinement. Here's the difference. Trauma keeps you stuck in the past. Refinement frees you from repeating it. You didn't relive the pain endlessly. You extracted the lesson and moved forward. That's how you know it wasn't meant to wound you permanently. Pain stayed only long enough to upgrade your perception. Once the lesson integrated, the pain lost its purpose, and like every completed function, it released. That's why you can now remember what hurt you without collapsing. The memory exists, but the charge is gone. That means the instructor has left the room. You don't miss the pain. You don't glorify it. You respect what it taught you. And what it taught you most of all is this: anything that costs you your clarity is too expensive. Pain didn't make you smaller. It made you precise. 7. Detachment is the upgrade. At some point, you stopped gripping life so tightly. Not because you stopped caring, but because you learned the difference between caring and clinging. Detachment isn't coldness. It sips efficiency. Before you were emotionally invested in outcomes. You replayed conversations. You anticipated reactions. You carried the weight of what might happen. That constant attachment drained your energy long before anything actually occurred. Then something changed. You still showed up, but without desperation. You still tried, but without fear of loss. You still loved, but without self-erasure. That's detachment. Detachment means you participate fully while remaining internally free. It's the ability to engage without becoming entangled. You act, but you're not owned by the result. This is why life suddenly feels lighter. When attachment dissolves, anxiety loses its fuel. Fear feeds on imagined futures. Detachment collapses those imagined futures into the present moment, where action is simple and clean. You no longer ask, what if this goes wrong? You ask, is this aligned? That single shift changes everything. Detachment gives you access to choice. When you're attached, you react. When you're detached, you respond. Reaction is automatic. Response is deliberate. This is also why people may misunderstand you now. They think you are distant. They think you are unbothered. They think you have changed. You have, but not in the way they assume. You didn't lose depth. You lost dependency. Dependency blurs judgment. It makes you negotiate your values to preserve comfort. Detachment removes that distortion. You see clearly what costs too much, what drains you, and what deserves your energy. And here is the quiet power of detachment. It attracts without effort. When you stop chasing validation, you become grounded. When you stop needing outcomes, you become magnetic. Not because you're trying, but because presence is compelling. Detachment also protects your nervous system. You no longer ride emotional highs and lows. You stay centered, balanced, available. That stability is not passive. It sets strength under control. And once detachment integrates, it can't be undone. You can't unsee how much energy you wasted trying to control things that were never meant to be controlled. You don't just regret the old effort. You simply don't repeat it. Detachment isn't withdrawal from life. It steps mastery over it. 8. The old timeline needed your energy. The old timeline did not survive on luck. It survived on you, your attention, your fear, your overthinking, your emotional labor. That sets the part no one tells you. Timelines are not just sequences of events, they are energy agreements. They exist only as long as someone keeps investing belief, emotion, and identity into them. The moment that investment stops, the structure weakens, and you stopped feeding it. Not consciously at first, not deliberately, but instinctively, you began withdrawing energy from things that no longer resonated. You stopped emotionally rehearsing worst-case scenarios. You stopped chasing outcomes that felt empty. You stopped explaining yourself to systems that never truly listened. That withdrawal was subtle, but it was fatal to the old timeline. Because timelines don't collapse from attack. They collapse from starvation. Fear is fuel. Doubt is fuel. Urgency is fuel. Self-questioning is fuel. And one day, without making a dramatic declaration, you simply stopped supplying it. You didn't fight the old structure. You didn't rebel against it. You just didn't show up energetically anymore. That's when things began to fall apart. Situations that once relied on your emotional involvement suddenly lost momentum. Patterns that once repeated effortlessly began malfunctioning. Systems that depended on your compliance felt unstable. That wasn't coincidence. That was dependency being exposed. The old timeline needed you to believe in it. It needed you to fear consequences. It needed you to stay emotionally invested in outcomes that were never aligned with your growth. But once your awareness shifted, belief loosened. And when belief loosens, reality reorganizes. You may have noticed that after you emotionally disengaged, events began resolving themselves without your interference. Problems dissolved instead of escalating. Situations ended without confrontation. Doors closed quietly instead of slamming shut. That's what happens when a timeline runs out of power. You also noticed something else. Guilt tried to appear. A subtle voice asking, "Am I doing enough? Am I abandoning something? Should I care more?" That guilt wasn't conscience. It was withdrawal symptoms. The old timeline was trained to survive on your emotional availability. When that availability disappeared, it attempted to pull you back in through obligation and fear. But you didn't respond. You stayed neutral. You stayed present. You stayed unavailable to manipulation. And neutrality is lethal to outdated realities. Because neutrality doesn't argue. It doesn't justify. It doesn't negotiate. It simply does not engage. This is the moment most people miss. They think the timeline collapsed because something external changed. No, it collapsed because you changed the signal. Your nervous system stopped broadcasting stress. Your mind stopped amplifying threat. Your identity stopped anchoring itself to old narratives. Once the signal changes, the receiver can no longer lock on. And here's the most important realization. You didn't destroy the old timeline. You outgrew its frequency. That's why you can observe it now without emotional charge. The memories exist, but they no longer pull you back. The patterns are visible, but they no longer hook you. That's how you know the collapse is complete. A timeline only has power while it can reach you, and it can reach you anymore. You didn't escape it by force. You escaped it by withdrawing belief. And once belief leaves, reality has no choice but to end the agreement. 9. Peace means authority. Peace is not the absence of problems. Peace is the absence of submission. What changed in you wasn't circumstance. It was command. You stopped negotiating with fear. You stopped rushing to fix what wasn't yours to carry. You stopped explaining yourself to forces that never asked for your truth, only your compliance. And suddenly, peace arrived. Not the soft, fragile peace people talk about, but a grounded, immovable peace. The kind that doesn't flinch when tension appears. The kind that doesn't spike when uncertainty enters the room. The kind that remains steady while everything else adjusts around it. That peace is authority. Real authority doesn't shout. It doesn't convince. It doesn't dominate. It settles. Before your energy scattered outward, you reacted to events. You adjusted yourself to situations. You tried to stay ahead of outcomes. That constant readiness looked like responsibility, but it was actually surrendering your center. Now your center holds. You respond instead of react. You pause instead of panic. You observe instead of assume. That pause is power, because in the pause, nothing controls you. Urgency used to dictate your behavior. When something felt urgent, you moved immediately. You explained. You justified. You compromised. That urgency was never random. It was leverage. But urgency no longer works. Now when something demands immediate emotional response, you feel it and let it pass. You choose your timing. You choose your words. You choose your involvement. That choice is sovereignty. Peace is not passive acceptance. It is internal command without noise. You don't feel the need to dominate conversations. You don't feel the need to win arguments. You don't feel the need to prove your worth. Because worth that needs proof isn't set secure. What replaced that need is something stronger. Presence. Presence communicates more than force ever could. People sense it. Situations respond to it. Conflict loses momentum around it. That's why drama dissolves near you now. Not because you suppress it, but because drama requires reaction to survive, and you no longer provide it. This is also why some people feel unsettled around you. They're used to accessing you through emotion, through guilt, through expectation, through pressure. But when they reach for those levers now, there's nothing there. No hook, no escalation, no reinforcement, just calm. That calm is not weakness. It is final. Authority doesn't chase outcomes. It sets conditions, and your inner state has set a new condition for reality. Only what aligns may remain. This is why fear feels quieter now. Fear still appears, but it doesn't convince. It presents itself like an outdated argument you've already outgrown. You hear it, but you don't obey it. Because obedience has shifted inward, you no longer serve fear. Fear reports to you. That sets authority, and once authority stabilizes, it cannot be taken away by circumstance. It doesn't depend on success or failure. It doesn't rise and fall with approval or rejection. It exists independently. That's why peace arrived without permission. Not as relief, but as command established. You didn't escape chaos. You outgrew its jurisdiction. 10. Freedom feels anticlimactic. Freedom does not arrive with fireworks. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't feel dramatic. It doesn't ask for celebration. That's else why so many people miss it. You were trained to expect transformation to feel explosive, a rush of joy, a surge of confidence, a sudden sense of destiny fulfilled. But when freedom finally arrived, it felt ordinary, quiet, neutral, unremarkable. And that confused you, because after everything you survived, you expected more. But real freedom doesn't elevate emotion. It stabilizes it. Before, your emotional state rose and fell with circumstances. Success brought relief. Failure brought anxiety. Hope surged, then crashed. Life felt like a cycle of anticipation and disappointment. Freedom interrupts that cycle. It doesn't eliminate emotion. It removes emotional dependence on outcomes. You stop waiting for external events to validate your inner state. That's subs why freedom can feel flat at first. There sips no emotional spike to chase, no high to maintain, no crash to recover from, just presence. And presence feels boring to a mind trained on intensity. But boredom is not emptiness. It sups stability without stimulation. That sips the part that takes time to integrate. You may have noticed moments where you asked yourself, is this it? Why don't sit I feel more excited? Shouldn't sit this feel bigger? Those questions aren't disappointment. They're withdrawal symptoms from emotional dependency. The mind was conditioned to equate meaning with intensity. Drama felt important. Struggle felt purposeful. Without those spikes, the mind initially feels underwhelmed. But underneath that neutrality is something new: consistency. Your energy doesn't spike and collapse anymore. You don't ride waves of hope and fear. You don't attach your sense of self to what happens next. That sep's not numbness. That sep's independence. Freedom doesn't heighten experience. It simplifies it. You stop interpreting everything as a test or a threat. Life becomes straightforward. Problems become solvable instead of overwhelming. And that simplicity can feel anticlimactic to someone who lived in survival mode for too long. But survival mode isn't set life. It sups maintenance. Freedom is maintenance no longer required. That's why you didn't feel the urge to announce your arrival. You didn't feel the need to prove anything. You didn't rush to do something with your freedom. You just existed. And that existence felt that it says how you know it, it says real. If freedom depended on excitement, it wouldn't last. Excitement fades. Calm remains. And calm creates room for deliberate creation. Here's the shift. Most people never reach. Freedom is not about feeling better. It sups about being uncontrolled. You are no longer driven by urgency. You are no longer managed by fear. You said no longer chasing emotional resolution. That absence of pressure can feel empty until you realize how much of your life was spent under it. Only then do you recognize what freedom actually gave you: time, choice, space. Space to act without compulsion. Space to create without proving. Space to live without bracing for impact. Freedom doesn't ask for applause. It just removes the cage. And once the cage is gone, you don't celebrate the bars disappearing. You simply stop noticing them. 11. You are no longer accessible to the old you. At some point, something irreversible happened. You didn't notice it immediately. There was no announcement, no clear moment you could point to. But access was cut. The old version of you, the one that reacted instantly, doubted endlessly, over-explained, overgave, and overcarried, no longer has permission to operate. Not because you rejected it, but because it expired. You can feel this when old triggers try to return. Situations that once hijacked your emotions now barely register. Words that once pierced now pass through without embedding. Patterns that once pulled you back now feel distant, almost foreign. That sets not healing in progress. That sets healing completed. When healing is unfinished, old wounds reopen easily. When healing is complete, the memory exists but the reaction does not. The stimulus arrives, but there's no response waiting for it. That sets how you know access is gone. The old you cannot be activated anymore. Not by pressure, not by guilt, not by fear, not by nostalgia. Those doors don't lock with force. They lock with awareness. You have seen too much to go back. You understand now how manipulation worked, how urgency was used, how emotional leverage disguised itself as responsibility. Once seen clearly, those mechanisms lose all power. You don't just need to fight them. They simply don't function on you anymore. This is why attempts to pull you back feel awkward instead of tempting. Conversations that once spiraled now end quickly. Situations that once drained you now resolve without effort. You didn't just become cold. You became unavailable to distortion. There's a subtle grief that comes with this realization. Not sadness, but recognition. A quiet understanding that the version of you that endured so much can no longer be reached, even by you. You can remember them, you can honor them, but you cannot re-enter that state. That accepts not loss. That accepts liberation sealed. This is also why you no longer romanticize the past. You see it clearly. The compromises, the confusion, the emotional cost. The past doesn't call to you anymore because it no longer contains anything you need. And that sets the most definitive sign of evolution. When nostalgia loses its pull, the timeline is closed. The old you was built for survival. It needed constant vigilance, explanation, adaptation, but survival mode can't coexist with clarity. Once clarity stabilizes, survival mode deactivates permanently. You didn't abandon who you were. You completed them. That version of you did its job. It endured. It endured. It learned. It carried you through terrain that required resilience above all else. And when its role ended, it stepped aside. No drama, no resentment, no unfinished business, just relief. Now when challenges appear, you face them differently. You don't brace, you don't shrink, you don't spiral. You assess, you choose, you act, or you don't. That choice is everything. You are no longer accessible to the old you because the system that required them no longer exists. The frequency changed, the environment changed, the rules changed, and access does not cross frequencies. This is why there is no going back. Not because you refuse to return, but because there is nothing there for you anymore. The door didn't slam shut, it dissolved, and you walked forward without looking back. Not out of pride, but because forward is the only direction that still responds to you. 12. This is not a beginning. It's a release. Everyone talks about new beginnings, but what you experienced was not a beginning. It was a release. Beginnings require effort. They demand planning, force, and intention. They come with pressure, the pressure to prove, to build, to become. But what happened to you didn't ask for effort. It asked for permission. Permission to stop carrying what was never meant to be permanent. Permission to stop rehearsing identities that already served their purpose. Permission to stop asking what sibs next, when the real question was, what can finally be put down? That's why this phase didn't feel like excitement. It felt like exhale. You didn't step into something new, you stepped out of something old, out of obligation, out of internal resistance, out of constant self-correction, out of the belief that you must struggle to justify your existence. Release doesn't arrive loudly. It arrives when the body realizes it no longer needs to brace. You may have noticed this subtly. Muscles relaxing without reason, breath deepening without effort, thoughts slowing without force. A strange sense that you no longer need to figure life out the way you used to. That sips not confusion. That sips trust returning. Release means the mind no longer interferes with what the deeper self already knows how to do. You stop micromanaging reality. You stop forcing timelines. You stop pushing doors that were never meant to open. And here sits the truth most people never reach. Creation follows release automatically. You don't need to chase purpose after this phase. Purpose reorganizes around clarity. When resistance dissolves, direction emerges on its own, quietly, naturally, without urgency. That's why nothing dramatic followed the collapse. No sudden calling, no urgent mission, no overwhelming vision, just space. And space is not emptiness. Space is potential without pressure. You're no longer driven by the need to become someone. You already are. You don't need to announce it. You don't need to optimize it. You don't need to defend it. You simply live from it. This is where many people get uncomfortable. Without struggle, without urgency, without internal conflict, the mind asks, what am I supposed to do now? The answer is simple and unsettling. Nothing you don't mean. Release strips life down to what's genuine. What remains after release is not obligation. It's alignment. You move when something resonates. You rest when nothing calls. You act without desperation. That sits not stagnation. That sets integration. Integration is the final stage of any transformation. It's where the change stops feeling like a process and starts feeling like normal. You no longer reference the past to explain yourself. You no longer anticipate the future to justify yourself. You start here, and here is enough. This is why the cycle had to end cleanly, not with chaos, not with revenge, not with proof, but with quiet certainty. You don't need to convince anyone that something is over. When something is truly finished, it no longer requires attention, and that sits where you are now. Not at the start of something, not at the edge of something, but free from something. The old timeline didn't lead you here to begin again. It led you here so you could finally stop carrying what was never yours to keep. Congratulations. It set's finally over. If you made it to this point, there's nothing left to chase. The questions that used to keep you awake, the pressure that made everything feel urgent, the version of you that survived instead of lived, that chapter is closed. You don't need to rush into the next phase. You don't need to prove that something changed. You don't need to explain yourself to anyone. The old timeline didn't collapse to punish you. It collapsed because it finished its purpose. From this moment forward, move slowly, choose deliberately, speak only when it sets true, act only when it sets aligned. Everything that belongs to you will meet you without force, and everything that required suffering to sustain it has already let go. So take a breath. You're not late, you're not lost, and you're not starting over. You've been released. Congratulations. It's finally over.